The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2023 is awarded to the Norwegian author Jon Fosse for his innovative plays and prose which give voice to the unsayable.
Hi everyone, today I'll talk about the Nobel Prize in Literature. More specifically about some big names who were left out by the Nobel Prize. I've decided to give them prizes for each decade for the last 120 years. I'll tell you who these names are and which decade they should receive the Nobel Prize. But first, let me tell you about the winner of this year's Nobel Prize in Literature, Jon Fosse. So I don't know anything about him, but just looking at his Wikipedia page, let me just point out a few facts. He was born in 1959, and when he was 7, he had a very serious accident, almost killed him. His first novel is titled Red Black, published in 1983. There might be some reference to Stendhal's novel, The Red and the Black. I don't know, I haven't read it. And he also wrote a play, and its title, And We'll Never Be Parted, was published in 1994. So he's written novels, short stories, poetry, children's book, essays, and plays. His works have been translated into more than 40 languages. He also played music, the fiddle, and much of his teenage writing practice involved creating his own lyrics for musical piece. Fosse was made a Chevalier of the Order of National du Mérite of France in 2003. When the French give you a prize, I think the Nobel Prize usually is followed. Fosse has also been ranked number 83 on the list of top 100 living geniuses of the Daily Telegraph. Since 2011, Fosse has been granted the Groton, an honorary residence owned by the Norwegian state located on the premises of the Royal Palace and the city centre of Oslo. Use of the Groton as a permanent residence is an honor specially bestowed by the King of Norway for contributions to Norwegian arts and culture. Fosse was among the literary consultants to Bible 2011, a Norwegian translation of the Bible published in 2011. Fosse was awarded the 2015 Nordic Council's Literature Prize for the trilogy Wakefulness, Olaf's Dream, and Weariness. Numerous of Fosse's work have been translated into Persian by Muhammad Hamad, and his works have been performed in Iran, Tehran, main halls. That's interesting. In April 2022, his new novel, A New Name, Septology 6th and 7th, translated into English by Damien Searles, was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. The book was named a finalist for the 2023 National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction. Between working on his novel, Fosse works as a translator on other authors' works. Personal life: he lives part of time with his second wife, a Slovak, in Heinberg an der Donau in Austria. He also has a home in Bergen and 2 homes in western Norway. Wow, he's got a lot of homes. Originally a member of the Church of Norway, although he described himself as an atheist before 2012, he joined the Catholic Church in 2012 and hospitalized himself to rehabilitate his long-term alcohol consumption. So here's a list of his prose and plays, some of them translated into English, and his compilations in English, and his poetry and essays. So he's written quite a lot. And these are the awards that he's won before. Some of these big names are so big that they would appear in the top 50 writers of the past 150 years. And some of them would appear in the top 10 writers of the past 150 years. Now you might ask why the Nobel Prize ignored these people. Well, the simple answer is that the Nobel Prize probably made mistakes. They didn't realize they would become so big or they would be considered so great at the time. But that's not enough. Some of these big names were really big at the time and they knew they were great writers, but still they were ignored. You might wonder that the Nobel Prize has an agenda. You'll be right. While it's not given by the government, it has very close ties to both the Norwegian and the Swedish governments. So if you look at the list of past winners, it is concentrated around in Europe or the United States. And if you look at the rest of the world, it's pretty barren. So, these big names that are left out by the Nobel Prize in the past 120 years, and my solution is to give them a prize for each decade. Of course, during those decades they had to be alive. So I can't give a prize to Shakespeare or Homer. Okay, so let's start with the first decade. So the Nobel Prize was given in 1901 for the first time. The first name is obviously very close to home because he was Norwegian, and it's Henrik Ibsen, the most famous Norwegian playwright. He's only second to William Shakespeare in terms of how many of his plays been staged around the world. Now you might ask why he didn't win the Nobel Prize. I think one reason could be that his language is too vulgar. His most famous play, A Doll's House, likens marriage life to a cage for women. The second name is one of my favorite writers of all time. Anton Chekhov is considered the father of short stories today. He died in 1906. My third nominee is a Brazilian genius, Machado de Assis, who died in 1908. He revolutionized Brazilian and Portuguese literature. His best-known work is the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, about a man who narrates his own story from beyond the grave. And the Nobel Prize at that time didn't really consider anybody outside Europe. One of the biggest names they missed out was, of course, Mark Twain, died in 1910. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is one of the best novels written in the 19th century. And my last nomination for the first decade is, of course, Leo Tolstoy, who also died in 1910. If I have to choose between these names, I would choose Anton Chekhov. I think he was the most revolutionary in terms of writing short stories. Of course, it's my opinion. So let's move to the next decade of the 20th century. For the decade of 1910s, I have one name on the list, and he is my favorite writer of all time. And his novel is also my favorite novel of all time. It is Marcel Proust, who died in 1921. You could say he wasn't very well known at the time, but he started publishing his novels in 1913. So he must have been known to the Swedish Academy, but also at the time a lot of the winners were poets. Okay, let's move to the 1920s. So let's look at the list of the winners. Ino Kenneth Humson, his novel The Hunger is one of the best novels I've read. Also George Bernard Shaw and Henri Bergson, a great philosopher, not a novelist. I don't know why he's on the list. And of course, Thomas Mann. So who's my nominee? I nominate Franz Kafka for the 1920s. But Franz Kafka only became known after his death because his friend published his books. Another name that I would nominate for the 1920s is Le Xun, the Chinese writer, who is considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So let's move to the 1930s. I nominate James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. I think the Nobel Prize Committee didn't understand Joyce, so couldn't really finish his novel. Of course, a lot of people who consider James Joyce to be the greatest writer of all time. But for me, between the two, if I have to choose one, I would choose Virginia Woolf. Okay, let's move to the 1940s. So during the war, they did not give it the prize for the first 4 years of 1940s. And the only name that is on the list that I am familiar with is Hermann Hesse, the German Swiss writer, and also the American writer William Faulkner. My nominee for the 1940s is George Orwell, who published two of the greatest novels of all time, Animal Farm and 1984. Both were published in the 1940s. So I think Animal Farm was published in 1946 and 1984 was published in 1948, and Orwell died in 1950. So let's move to the 1950s. Hemingway is on the list, Laxton is on the list, and Albert Camus is on the list. And Boris Pasternak. For the 1950s, for the Decade Prize, I would nominate Nikos Kazantzakis, the Greek writer. He was nominated a few times, but sadly he didn't win. I think he wrote one of the greatest novels of all time, Zorba the Greek. It's one of my favorite novels. I think Friedrich Nietzsche would be proud of it. So let's move to the 1960s. So we have Ivo Andrich, John Steinbeck, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who refused to take the prize because he didn't want to be associated with the establishment. And Mikhail Sholokhov and Yasunari Kawabata, the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize. My nominee for the 1960s is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine short story writer. Now let's move to the 1970s. We have got Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Heinrich Böll is another big name. I nominate Vladimir Nabokov, who died in 1977. You know he was a genius because he wrote in 3 different languages. He wrote in Russian, English, and French. Let's move to the 1980s. So we have got Gabriel Garcia Marquez, William Golding, Najib Mahfouz. My nominee for the 1980s is Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer. We have a Nigerian writer already on the list here, so Chinua Achebe probably would not have been able to win it, but I think he deserved it. His novel, Things Fall Apart, is a masterpiece. Let's move to the 1990s. My nominee for the 1990s is Yashar Kemal, the Turkish writer. His greatest novel, Mehmet My Hawk, is one of the best stories I've read, and I think Yashar Kemal deserved the Nobel Prize. Let's move to the 2000s. We have Orhan Pamuk, the winner of 2006 Nobel Prize, Doris Lessing, 2007. Okay, my nominee for the 2000 is R.K. Narayan, the Indian writer who died in 2001. He's considered one of the best Indian novelists. Let's move to the 2010s. We've got Mario Vargas Llosa, Kazuo Ishiguro. I love Kazuo Ishiguro. He's one of my favorite writers. So I was very happy when he won the Nobel Prize. So who's my nominee for the 2010s? I would nominate the Iranian writer that nobody has heard about. So his name is Mahmoud Dalatabadi. He's the most celebrated Iranian novelist. Now let's move to the 2020s. So who's my nominee? I nominate Japanese writer Haruki Murakami. Now let's move to the 2030s. I nominate myself. I've written 5 books. If you don't believe me, check out my books. They are not the best literary works out there, but the best books in their field, probably. On a second thought, I don't want to win the prize, because if you look at the history of the prize, a lot of winners have died within 2 to 5 years after winning the prize. Let me tell you a few stats. About 30% of the winners died within 10 years after winning, 18% within 5 years, 10% within 2 years, and only 16% of the winners are still alive. So what is the bottom line? It just shows that you don't have to win the prize to be a good writer. So these writers, despite not winning the Nobel Prize, still were great writers and people enjoy reading them. Even if you don't win the prize, you belong to a list that includes Leo Tolstoy, Anton Chekhov, James Joyce, Jorge Luis Borges, and many great writers. What do you think? Do you agree with my nominees? Or do you think that even I have left out a great many writers? Leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching.